right. Well, I do want to get started and be defensive of everyone's time. Thank you to those who came out in this weather to be here tonight. Thank you to those who are attending online for taking the time. This is our April 3rd community forum to discuss Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3, also known as the MBTA zoning bylaw. Just for those who are aware, so we'll be proposing this as our TOD overlay at the May town meeting. So that's the same section that we're looking for compliance. So for those who are attending online, as we go, please feel free to drop your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. For those in attendance, I ask that you do please hold your questions until the end. I have quite a few slides to get through. I'm going to go through them very quickly. We will be able to go back to any of those and clarify. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, but I'm always happy to go back and kind of discuss in more detail if we have to go back to any of those slides. The discussion piece is really the core of what I'd like to get to today, but I think there's a lot of background that's important. So we're going to try to cover that pretty quickly for those who may not have been able to follow along as we've been going through this at the Select Board and the Planning Board and our community workshops. So looking at our presentation agenda today, we're going to cover what is the MBTA communities legislation. We're going to do a brief look at evaluating non-compliance with the MBTA zoning guidelines. We're going to discuss concepts of missing middle housing and regulating density, what that is, and then look at local context and strategies that we've pursued in development of our proposal. And then we're going to do some of the brief highlights of our proposal, and then again we're going to open it up to general discussion. And I'm happy to answer questions and kind of cover any details that the public would like to discuss. So briefly, what is the MBTA communities legislation? So it was enacted in January 14th, 2021 as part of the Economic Development Bond Bill. There's a number of compliance guidelines that have been issued since that bond bill was passed. Most notably August 10th, 2022, and then subsequent revisions as recent as August 17, 2023. And those guidelines provide the framework with which we have to develop zoning in. It's notable that on March 15th, 2023, the Attorney General issued an advisory that communities that fail to comply will be subject to potential civil enforcement action, as well as liability under the federal and state fair housing laws. By December 31st, 2024, Shrewsbury is required to adopt zoning, a zoning district meeting specific compliance requirements. I've covered those in previous presentations, and the detailed specifics of those guidelines are available on the EOHLC website, which is linked on our webpage. So talking about the MBTA communities legislation, what's the purpose behind the new law? So Massachusetts is in a housing crisis, and there's a need to produce more housing. The amount of housing that is financially attainable in the state to most households is dwindling, and the Commonwealth sees itself at a disadvantage to compete for businesses, jobs, and talent due to the high housing costs. And placing housing near transit is good housing, economic, transportation, and climate policy. So understanding that housing crisis and how that fits at the state level, the national level, and the local level. So Massachusetts has a higher home value and rental rates than most of the 50 states, outpaced really only by California and Hawaii in most cases. Construction trends, state and local level, both show consistent declines in new housing construction, and that's been since the 1980s, 1940s as well. Local age gaps are also a piece that we've been looking at. Locally, there's age gaps between the age range of 20 to 34, and then 60 plus, there's a significant drop. in populations, and we do see these as vulnerable populations in terms of housing costs. So that's the anecdotal evidence that we have of that is students that are returning to the community that they grew up in, unable to afford the house in the community that they grew up in, and then also retirees or those over 55, typically having hard times on fixed incomes, meeting those rising housing costs. It's important to note what the MBTA Communities Act is not. It's not a mandate to build housing, but it is a mandate to create a zoning district. It's not a housing production target, but it is required to allow multifamily development by right. It's not restricted to only addressing affordable housing needs, but there is a significant benefit locally to including affordable housing requirements, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. It's not a one-size-fits-all tool to meet all housing needs in the community, but it is a tool to support multifamily development, and it notably allows more local control than what's allowed under 40B. It's not viewed as optional by the Commonwealth and Attorney General, and noncompliance is subject to loss in funding opportunities and potential civil action. It's important to note that our existing, in terms of that affordability, that our existing local zoning does require for certain developments affordability requirements. Additionally, zoning is not housing production. There's additional factors that guide that production, and this legislation is geared towards breaking down some of those local barriers, but there's a lot of factors in terms of private development that go into actually generating a project, and that's not being undertaken at this time. So factors that play into that are market strength, financial feasibility of a specific project, developable sites, willing sellers, available labor to actually construct the units, and desirability of the community. It's important to note that this is just providing a zoning district. We are not proposing the actual creation of units. And also important to note that Chapter 40B already allows multifamily development to be proposed anywhere in town. So that is a key point here. Looking at the funding in terms of noncompliance that would be at risk, we do see a significant number of grants that we have pursued that are specifically called out that would no longer be eligible. We've received a number of Mass Works grants for the development of the Route 20 improvements, and a lot of those grants generate directly additional property tax revenue. So in the case of the Route 20 improvements, which were critical to the Edgemere redevelopment in FY24, that produced close to $1 million in annual tax revenue. We also see mass development grants that would no longer be eligible for. We use that as a site readiness at Centec Park, which was a $302,000 grant and generated a property tax revenue in FY24 of close to that $300,000. And additionally, we use a lot of the Massachusetts Downtown Initiative grants to conduct a number of studies which guide our local decision-making and really improve quality of life projects and a number of projects in the town center and for studying as we plan for growth. All in total, we've utilized close to $5 million of that grant funding that we would no longer be eligible for. And it's important to note that those grant opportunities are targeted typically at projects which generate additional tax revenues, especially where we can encourage additional commercial development to offset the home ownership tax burden, to reduce the local tax burden cost of services, infrastructure improvements, and again, to enhance quality of life, provide additional public engagement in local decision-making and planning processes, and also providing other intrinsic value. So it's not just a dollar for dollar. These grant opportunities also often open up doors for other funding sources and subsequent phases of work implementation and allow us to further a lot of the local initiatives that we're undertaking. So there's been a lot of discussion around the community housing capacity requirement, so it's important to really wrap our heads around what that is. So the Shrewsbury's capacity requirement is close to 1,500 units. It's important to note, again, we are not proposing that this is being developed. We simply have to propose zoning, which would support the creation of that many units. It does not consider existing units in the capacity formula. It assumes bare land, and I'll go a little bit more in detail of what that is. And part of that most recent revision to the guidelines allowed for a 25% offset of what it calls offset of mandatory mixed use, which allows us to permit with mixed use development and take a portion of those units, reducing our capacity requirement to 1,123 units by utilizing a mixed-use development strategy. So looking at the community housing capacity requirement, a little bit more detail, again, that bare land. So if you have 2 units existing, it treats it as an undeveloped parcel, and if you zone it for up to 4 units, that becomes your unit capacity, even though 2 are existing. So your unit capacity is 4. Giving a little bit of a breakdown of local examples of how that could play out in a little bit more detail. So Shrewsbury Commons is approximately 45 acres. There's existing 587 units across 5 parcels, and it's at approximately 13 units per acre. If you zone it at 15 units per acre, a developer could propose a maximum of 682 units, which is only 95 units in addition to what is existing. It does work the other way, so we're not proposing the zone over the Quinn 35 apartments, but using that as an example. That development is 8 acres and consists of 250 units. That's a dwelling unit per acre of approximately 31 units. And so if that was then zoned at 15 units per acre, our capacity for that zone would be 120 units, even though 250 are existing. So it really just looks at what is the zoning supporting. It's important to note when we talk about these densities, they already exist in town. These are local examples. We have a variety of housing existing in town, everything from single-family, detached, tight-knit neighborhoods, row houses, townhouses, condos, and even high-rises. And so these do exist, and to the extent in drawing our zoning boundaries, we did look to target existing density. What this is proposing, the MBTA communities, really the goal of it is looking at that middle housing. So not necessarily the high-rise developments, but that middle housing in between single family and the high-rise. So looking at triplexes, row houses, condos, and that interim level low-rise development of housing. There is a housing cost burden in town. I'm not going to go real in-depth on this, but what we do see from our housing production plan is that significant proportions, especially in the rental community, are spending over 35% of their income towards housing costs. 30% of your income going to housing costs is considered a housing cost burden, and so we do see that significant portions of our community are already paying high housing costs. That's important to note, again, when we talk about those vulnerable populations and the struggle that people have in terms of affording living in the community. So in addition to the affordability, there's other local benefits to providing development that generates affordable units. Most notably is our safe harbor threshold. So again, 40B development, which significantly limits local control. There's certain safe harbor provisions that we can achieve. Target goals for specific to Shrewsbury are either 74 units in a 1-year period or 148 years in a 2-year period. What that would translate to, if that's achieved, By generating 74 affordable units, we would receive 1 year of safe harbor, which means that we could still pursue a friendly 40B development, but we're in no way required to pass a 40B project. Similarly, the 148 units would achieve a 2-year safe harbor provision, and we can use that strategically with friendly 40B developments or generation of projects that do create affordable units to keep ourselves in safe harbor to the extent possible with those units. The only other way to achieve safe harbor is to achieve that 10%. A lot of people say, I've heard of the 10% subsidized housing inventory. And so if you're not in the 10%, that's the other way of achieving safe harbor, is to get the 10% of the year-round housing stock. And it's important to talk about what we mean by affordable housing. So for our affordability components, we use the Worcester, Massachusetts metro area. The median family income in that metro area is $122,000 for median family income. So we are a fairly affluent area. What that translates to is these are the maximum incomes for people to qualify for those affordable units. So it does scale in terms of persons in the family as well as the income limits. We are restricted under the current MBTA guidelines at 80% income limits. So that would translate into a family of 4 being a household income of $93,600 qualifying for affordable units. And that does scale in terms of how many persons are in the family. Likewise, on the developer's end, that translates to cap and maximum rents, or in the case of single-family homes or condominiums, maximum sale prices. It's important to note these are the 2024 figures for those. So a 2-bedroom affordable unit would go at a rate of $1,661 a month. Likewise, a single-family home price would be restricted to a maximum sale price of $242,000. While a condominium would be $224,000. So as we looked at how do we comply with the MBTA zoning guidelines, we took a number of zoning considerations into account, looking specifically at proximity to existing and proposed high-density housing and infrastructure, really looking to limit from that capacity requirement the generation of new units. We wanted to look at the proximity to multimodal traffic opportunities. We evaluated single-site and multi-site options, and we also evaluated impacts to commercial and industrial zones. We've been conducting significant public outreach in terms of this, including online forums, online surveys, in-person forums, as well as presentations to the Select Board and Planning Board. We developed our regular project page, and we've also done direct email engagement to town meeting members. So as we go through that, we'll go through some of the results of what we found from that survey. The survey that we conducted online, the results of that showed a strong leaning towards looking for redevelopment opportunities of abandoned, vacant, or underutilized buildings, and using this zoning as a tool to drive redevelopment. There's also a strong indication to include commercial components if and where possible. It also showed a preference for shorter buildings, around 2 to 3 stories, at the expense of not allowing open space on the property. There's also a preference towards townhomes or row houses, again, trying to keep that ultimate dwelling unit per acre density lower. A new feature in this survey, we were actually able to geolocate comments. People were able to drop a pin on a map of Shrewsbury and locate a comment with that. We had comments all across the community and even some outside, which was interesting to see. We have a lot of those comments were related to proximity to WRTA infrastructure and the MBTA stations, as well as highways and intersections. There was a strong indication of open space opportunities, as well as, again, comments indicating areas that needed redevelopment and where those abandoned, vacant, or underutilized buildings were located. And many of those identified areas were ones that we were already in the process of evaluating. So it was good to see that we had a similar mindset to what we were seeing from the community input. So the draft proposal, kind of bringing it back a little bit. So the key compliance criteria that we have to do is a minimum acreage of 50 acres. The capacity requirement, again, is just shy of 1,500 units. If you do some quick math there, at 15 dwelling units per acre, that means that you have to zone 100 acres to stay at 15 dwelling units per acre. So there is that interplay of acreage versus unit capacity. Mandatory mixed use was that provision that was allowed in the August 23 revision. It allows for that 25% allowable offset. We look to maximize that to protect commercial and industrial space in our proposal, while still leveraging mixed use as a way to achieve that offset. That reduced our capacity requirement to 1,123 units. Again, those key community goals that we really were looking to drive through the zoning is looking at redevelopment and existing density, looking at the commercial components and requiring that where feasible, and going towards shorter structures, limiting density over the provision of open space. We identified and evaluated 6 possible district sites across the community and came up with this proposal. So our proposed overlay draft is in the Route 9, Route 20 Cloverleaf area. Most notably includes the Christmas Tree Shops Plaza, Shrewsbury Commons, and Minna Terrace housing development. It's approximately 173 acres. The residential under that is 95 acres, with the commercial and industrial zones under that as 78 acres. So again, that additional acreage over the 50-acre minimum, that additional acreage allows us to pursue minimum densities while meeting that capacity requirement, and also includes mandatory mixed-use provisions to make sure that we're not impacting commercial industrial zones by allowing multifamily only by right. Considerations that we were taking into account for this zone is the proximity to the Northborough proposed districts, and most recently the Westborough district, as they just passed recently. It has access to both Route 9 and Route 20. It has a redevelopment opportunity, most notably the Christmas Tree Shops Plaza and some of the older housing developments. There is also existing water constraints, which would limit the actual development on these sites, most notably along Walnut Street, where there is water constraints there. There's also the proximity to the Westborough station. It's approximately 1.5 miles from the Westborough station. I won't say that it's walkable, but it is that distance from there. And it meets what we were looking at is the minimum effective compliance. How do we comply with the bylaw without generating a significant number of new units? It's important to note in terms of the language where we're driving design guidelines to really drive these projects to be amenable to the community and what we can expect. So the underlying zoning, it's important to note, is not affected by this proposal. It's proposed as an overlay district. So the property owners where this zoning is proposed over can choose to pursue one or the other. They can still, they're not rendered non-conforming by the passage of the zoning. They can still develop under the regular commercial or industrial zones or residential zones. But they can choose to utilize this zoning if they wish to. They cannot pick and choose from zones the provisions of each. They have to choose when they go to permitting which district and zoning bylaw they're utilizing. There's a max residential density by right, as we've currently written it, at 15 units per acre. We're proposing it as a transit-oriented development style, so that's why it's a TOD overlay. And what that is really looking to drive transportation infrastructure. And it's looking at extensive design guidelines. What we've done is we've taken the Lakeway Overlay District design guidelines and modified them to be somewhat more robust. We're also requiring a number of studies depending upon the project scope. So for many of the projects, we'll require a local and regional transit analysis, really looking at the WRTA routes, local ride shares, whether it's Via or Uber and Lyft, and as well as sidewalk networks, bike networks, and trying to have them provide that analysis of where those opportunities are. For units that, or for proposals that include over 50 residential units, we're requiring a school bus route analysis. So they do have to coordinate with the school department in order to determine where school bus routes along local roads can be located. And we're also looking at, for larger projects, provision of sidewalks along the entirety of the public ways, as well as a mobility hub, looking at that transit-oriented design. And what the mobility hub would require is the developer to choose a number of amenities, whether it's bike infrastructure, bus stop infrastructure, and provide that all in one location. What it does is it drives what's called mode shift, which is going from biking to getting on a bus, from going from a ride share to getting on the bike. And so it's providing a number of amenities in order to provide that mode shift, going from one transportation mode to another. So you can take your car, you can park there, and then go with the bus to the train station, again, utilizing multiple transit modes to get to your destination and providing that infrastructure for that shift in modes. Finally, we're requiring mandatory mixed use anywhere that the underlying zone is commercial or industrial. So where the underlying zone is commercial or industrial, they will be required to include a commercial component. The multifamily by right will only be allowed where it's an existing residential district underlying. And finally, we're utilizing the language to encourage vertical mixed use by right over horizontal mixed use. And so what that is, vertical mixed use is the more traditional, where the uses, both commercial and industrial, are all located in a single structure, rather than horizontal mixed use, which is similar to the Lakeway Commons or Edgemere redevelopment, where you have a commercial component separate from a strictly residential component in separate structures. And it's important, so the horizontal mixed use would still be allowable, but it would trigger a special permit with the planning board to achieve the maximum local control. So looking at our timeline, we've had a number of public outreach, really ramped up fall and winter of 2023. March, we did our draft zoning to the planning board and select board. We're now in April moving towards May town meeting, where we're looking to propose the zoning to town meeting for their vote. We are holding fall town meeting if needed, and part of that is because once the zoning is passed, it gets submitted to the state, and we only know if what we have passed is compliant after that. And so we want to hold that fall town meeting in case there is revisions that need to be made in order to remain in compliance by that December deadline. Important dates to note, April 3rd, we're here now, the MBTA Public Forum. Again, thank you for coming out. Tomorrow, we'll have the planning board public hearing on our zoning. April 19th, we'll have a drop-in session, which will be in conference room A at the Municipal Center. That'll be from 10 a.m. to noon. You can meet with staff, and we're happy to, in a more one-on-one environment, review any of your questions. May 2nd, we'll have another planning board hearing. And then May 15th, we're having another drop-in session, 6 o'clock to 8 p.m. So with that, thank you for that presentation. I know it was a lot. Again, I'm happy to go back to any of those slides, and I'm happy to open it up. I'm going to start with if we have questions from the online, and if not, then we'll go into questions from the public, and thank you. Oh, okay. If I just X out of this. Let's see if I can. All right, so Carolyn Higgins, doesn't zoning by right mean they will be able to build? If you zone it, they will build. We can't afford more people in town schools. So that's a good question. So zoning by right does not mean that there's no permitting process. By right means that it still goes to planning board for site plan approval. We've included that provision that any project proposed under this requires site plan approval. That's not our most robust in terms of local control. It is still limited, but that is the maximum local control that we're allowed to remain in compliance with the MBTA guidelines. Again, we've also written it that many of the mixed-use proposals or anything beyond that minimum compliance would trigger a special permit, which does allow additional local control from the planning board. In terms of the schools, so we do track the generation of school children from projects such as this. We provide a snapshot of that annually from those numbers to the select board and have a memo for that. We've provided a brief summary of that, but in short, multifamily style developments typically generate between 0.06 and 0.6 school-aged children per unit, whereas subdivisions typically generate approximately one school child per unit generated. So, so we do track that. We're going to try to do, prior to town meeting, a more robust analysis in terms of actual fiscal impacts related to that as well. So again, talking about capacity of 1,500 units. As I mentioned, we're not proposing the actual creation of the 1,500 units. This is just in terms of developing the zoning. There's other constraints in terms of actual development of units. That is, again, we talked about that local control in terms of financial feasibility. Specific projects will have to be vetted, and we are still doing the local approval process. Looking at ways to reduce rent for young families, so that wouldn't any of those efforts. We do look at that, but any of those efforts would not render us compliant for MBTA, which is what we're here to discuss tonight. What studies have been done to explore the environmental wildlife impact of building this huge volume of apartments near the bobcat habitat by the Christmas tree shops and behind the Y. The proposed zone that we've drawn is primarily over, again, we've looked to pursue existing density, so it's primarily over areas that are already developed and largely to, almost 100% of those lots size. Each lot is pretty much fully developed out, so this would be more of a redevelopment effort in many of those lots. There's a lot of questions from Carolyn Higgins, so maybe we'll see if we can bring her in at some point. 173 acres proposed. That's not really. So of the 173 acres proposed to have existing dwelling units, so again, that includes the Shrewsbury Commons development, as well as the Minna Terrace housing development. There's approximately 644 existing housing units that are already in the district. And so again, by including additional acreage, it allows us to pursue a mandatory mixed-use component, and it also allows us to provide for that minimum compliance by reducing the actual dwelling unit per acre. Great question at the very end. Do we, the town residents, get a vote in this? Absolutely. So this is going to May town meeting. And so that is why we're trying to inform the residents to make sure that you can make an informed vote. And this is subject to town meeting vote in May. So you absolutely get a vote in this. With that, I mean, we can go back to some of those other questions, but I do want to give some time to the I do want to go back to the people in the room, and then we can go back to some of those other. And I'm happy to go back to any of those slides.
Thanks for doing this, Chris.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so just for the people in the who are online. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Can you go back to the grants?
Absolutely.
I'm curious on it, the time being. Thanks for hosting this.
Is there a specific, like, which one is these?
I guess just in general, if you could clarify, is that the very first one?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just curious of the explanation of the grants. So in general, grants, when we apply, obviously we're never guaranteed a grant, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so this isn't necessarily guaranteed money year after year for whatever grants we get. So there's a really good chance we may not even get the $5 million when we apply for different grants.
So it's important, so I just want to make the distinction, the $5 million, that's funding we're already utilizing. So,
Right.
And I think it's important to note that as a town, we do aggressively pursue grants. It does make up a significant amount of the work that we do in terms of stretching the local dollar.
Right. So clarify for me property tax revenue generated and that total, because I'm trying to understand how that's tax revenue generated if this is a grant.
Yeah, so the grant, we received $3,750,000 for the Route 20 improvements. It was a $4.4 million project. What that ended up generating, so the Edgemere redevelopment project in FY24 has generated property tax revenue of close to $1 million. And that Route 20 improvement was critical to attracting that development and facilitating that development. Okay.
Can you flip forward? I think it kind of answered the other questions. So for example, even the town visitors visioning center study and the other smaller grants, those again are still not guaranteed year after year, correct?
Right, and so those, the town center visioning study and the Massachusetts Downtown Initiative grants, that's where I wanted to include those because we wouldn't be able to pursue those similar initiatives. And I think that goes to, we didn't attach a revenue generated because it's more of an intrinsic value where we're able to review in terms of wayfinding. We're able to implement some of the signage that you'll see in town, in the center of town, and then able to conduct studies such as the local rapid recovery plan, which was in relation to COVID and assisting businesses, creating a plan to assist businesses to recover from the effects of COVID.
Gotcha. I'll ask two other quick questions because I'm sure there's more. If you flip a couple more, one is on the zoning map, real quick.
Sorry.
Has to do with the 50 acres. You can do the overlay of the parcel, I guess. My understanding, if I'm understanding it correctly, we have to zone 50 acres is the minimum?
A minimum of 50 acres.
Okay,
correct.
and of those 50 acres, you're saying we should really zone 100 acres, correct?
Well, so, not necessarily. So
Okay.
the minimum requirement is 50 acres
Yep.
and a capacity requirement of 1,500 units. There's also the requirement that it's at least 15 units per acre. So 15 units per acre over 100 acres meets that capacity requirement. If you just did 50 acres, you would need to pursue a larger dwelling unit per acre density in order to achieve that capacity requirement.
Okay. And is there any actual distance requirement that we have to meet under this mandate
So-
to get to, because that leads me into the next question. If you split the parcel and have a total of 50 acres or beyond, which I understand the 1,500 units is what they're saying, but that leads me to what is going to be required down the road of, you're talking about the transportation like hub? Is that the right
The
word?
mobility hub.
The mobility hub,
Yeah.
because my fear is they're then gonna mandate those.
So,
That's my fear, it's gonna be mandate
Right.
to follow all of this.
so the mobility hub, yeah, absolutely. So the mobility hub, that is something that we're requiring any potential developer to implement. So that's not something that the town would be implementing, as part of a project that's proposed. They would have to, design and as part of their project, incorporate a mobility hub feature as an amenity of their project. Yep.
And pay for.
Yes, I did hear that. I did hear that, yes.
I guess I just had a couple, say philosophical / legal questions, because I know you reference it in the beginning where you talk about the Attorney General stating that there could be civil and other penalties, but if you actually look at 3A, it's very, very simple. It's like 3 paragraphs. It says you have to have a reasonable sized parcel, right, that's at a minimum of 15 units per acre, that is within a half a mile of a transit hub. Well, it actually says subway, bus, ferry, or
Yeah.
commuter rail. But, and if applicable, which for the actual adjacent community, which we are, isn't applicable. But for the EOHLC, right, in that statute just says shall create guidelines, right, that will be propagated for compliance. That's it. That's all it says. So when you look at those guidelines, they're actually more like regulations, which never went through 30A. So they didn't go for public comment, and one could argue, and actually Milton argues in their response, that it's unconstitutional and that those guidelines shouldn't be utilized because they didn't follow the proper process. So I think it's more of a concern about, should we allow the state to dictate what we do? Because today, we as a community can approve any of these plans that would be brought, correct? If somebody brings a plan to do exactly what you're proposing under this, the planning board, everybody could approve it. We don't require the zoning district to do that.
So we're just proposing the zoning. Any project would be subject to the
But you could do
applicable
it
local
today.
controls.
Like, without this overlay district, the same types of projects.
Under 40B, you
future,
could.
You could do all that.
Under a 40B.
Right, so we don't, as a community, I guess my point is, don't necessarily need, like, this isn't giving us, all it's doing is it's forcing us to give up our rights to be able to zone certain areas in a certain manner to the state. Because we could zone it if we so chose. If somebody brings a project to us as a community, we could approve it.
Right, so it's mandating zoning, and
Right.
I won't say that it completely dictates what we zone, and that's why we've written where the most flexibility in this is in the design guidelines. It doesn't specify the specific language that we have to put into, and so we've put a lot into that in terms of any project developed out of this. That's how we're, requiring the mobility hubs,
But there's
requiring
no
the
guarantees
studies.
the state's gonna approve that. So your point is, say, if you put that on and it gets approved through town meeting, right, the state can come back and say, we don't agree with this, you have to make these changes, and then we would have to go back for compliance.
Right, and so that's why we're pursuing this at Maytown meeting.
Yep.
So that way, once we've had EOHLC and the AG's office reviewed it and give their comments back, if we need to make revisions in order to be in compliance, we'll still be able to do so at a fall town meeting. I'm hopeful, and we're doing our best we can to make sure that this is compliant as is. But again, what we've seen is a lot of the communities have passed it, and comments come back, and either their parking regulations are too strict or whatever it is, and they have to go back and revise their zoning, so.
And then just one clarification on the grants. Are you including all the 13 in addition to the 4 that were specifically in the statute?
Yeah, so that 5 million is from the 13 discretionary grants that they identified, so within that's.
Which may not be constitutional or legal, based off of the fact that it's in a guideline and not actually in the
Well-
statute. Because it's clear in the statute of what the penalties are.
I understand the point. I think the clearest example is Milton, that regardless of that argument and the legality of it,
Yeah.
which is still going through the courts, the AG's office and they've already said that they are removing that funding. And it's not just the funding that in the future, they've actually repealed grants that they had.
But it is
so-
going to this Supreme Judicial Court for decision, so
Right.
they can take the money away, but doesn't mean they're allowed to.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still in the courts, working its
Right.
way through the courts.
Right, and if the last thing, and then I'll stop, but, so I guess the other thing is, if the Supreme Judicial Court, because in that case, they're actually suggesting that it's unconstitutional, or that portions of this is above and beyond the intent of the legislature, right? If we go ahead and put this zoning district in, it's not like it automatically goes away. We would have to then go and, if they said, hey, this, you don't have to comply the way it was, so would it make more sense just to wait until the case came out, and wait for October town meeting to make a decision?
Well, that would likely, that's gonna take a long time to go through the courts and render a decision. We would become non-compliant in the interim of that, and we wouldn't be able to pursue that grant funding. Again, that makes up a significant amount of a lot of the work that we do. I know DPW, again, that MassWorks grant, they pursue that consistently, and that is a significant portion of what they do in terms of providing services to the community for the infrastructure that we need. So I think it would come at a significant detriment to the quality of life that we do have in town.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm back. I'm closing. Hi. I just want to build on, Brian Costello, I just want to build on what the last gentleman was saying. If there is a court case, and there's multiple court cases, the point I think we're trying to make, let's say this does not pass town meeting, right? Which I think some of us hope it doesn't. In that case, you're going to be non-compliant anyway, correct?
So as of January 1st, if we have not passed zoning of 2025, if we haven't passed zoning by then we would be rendered non-compliant.
So what's the total town budget today, approximate?
I think it was 175?
173 million? So 5 million isn't a significant portion of that. It's a portion of that, right? It's less than, 5%? Less than 5%, right? 3%. So the grants we are at risk from, which are future grants that we don't know what they will be, so we're not really at risk from anything from that perspective. We've spent the money that they've given us. We don't have to ask for more grants. It's a small portion of our current total budget. Given that this is the state attempting to take away some instances of home rule, and wouldn't we be better suited to talk to other towns that have the same concerns and figure out how to change this with the state? In other words, if enough towns are not going to comply, the Attorney General can sue all she wants. She ain't gonna win. right? So, right, because
Yeah,
ultimately she'll
so-
get voted out anyway.
So we do actively discuss with a number of communities, whether it's planning at the staff level. I know there's a number, I know the town managers they have their group and forums that they all discuss. So there's a lot of conversations going on and a lot of different opinions and feelings towards that. I think it's telling that a significant number of those communities are pursuing zoning to become compliant. And I do think that, although there are communities that are pursuing non-compliant options, they're, by and far a minority in terms of that. Again, I'm not saying that we have to go one way or the other. But again, I think, the $5 million in grant funding, it's a significant portion of.
Some future funding, we can't say.
Of
5
future
million.
funding, and I do think, that is something that we do, Shrewsbury, more than other communities, is aggressive in pursuing grants. And we do that in an effort to stretch the local dollar. That $5 million in funding, although it's insignificant in terms of the overall town budget, without those funding opportunities, the question becomes to provide those services that the citizens, that the residents expect, and that quality of life that we expect. How do we make up that difference? And so the conversation shifts there, and I don't have that answer. That would be something we'd have to discuss.
Just one more question. 'Cause I know this
And
is
I
a
just, and I think the grant is one piece of it. I think the other telling part, and again, we've discussed a little bit in the nuances of it, but is that civil action. And so, that also comes at a cost to the town in terms of fighting those civil action.
And this law, it does state as of right. So while somebody does not have to get approval if they meet the minimum requirement, it's only if they, in other words, if you do this overlay, there's a minimum, I can come in and build to that minimum. The only time I need approval is if I'm above that minimum. And even then, your legs are pretty weak to stop them, just like you have with 40B.
Right, so not entirely. So at that minimum, so that's where we're requiring all of these projects to go through at least site plan approval.
Right.
That is largely, it's probably slightly more local control than a 40B development. I won't say that it's much more local
Right,
control. It's
pretty
probably on
weak.
par with it, with slightly more local control in terms of our abilities to manage that project from the local level. Again, we've written it where it's really to the minimum extent, the minimum that we can in terms of that site plan approval. Pretty much everything else will kick into the special permit. So we want to allow ourselves the flexibility in terms of a redevelopment project. If it's a project that really fits with the location, we want to have that flexibility for the planning board to consider that. And that special permit process really is, by and large, the most local control that the planning board has. And they have a lot of discretion in terms of issuing special permits.
Yeah, I think the worry is, and I'm not calling into question the intestinal fortitude of the planning committee, but I would say that we've seen a lot of additional units in this town, and it doesn't seem to stop. I don't think this zoning overlay is going to create something that's what we think. It's going to be a lot bigger, because we know how things work.
Right.
And
I think it's important to note that
the
it's,
worry there is, that's, I think, what those of us that are worried about it are worried about. And the burden on I'll give up the $5 million to save the burden on the schools, to be quite frank. We need to have a lot more discussion there, but, and I think you put up a slide about, affordable housing 55 plus. Don't forget, this is not an affordable housing law. And so as more market level comes into town, right? So if this is a market level zone, that increases your burden on 40B, right? So what ends up happening is you're going to have many more market-driven units, which is going to require more 40B, which is going to require more building because you have a lot less control over 40B. And I'll shut up now because I know other people have.
No, thank you. I mean, I just want to touch on a couple points. So in terms of the affordable housing, I think that's a great point in terms of the 10%, right? And so Under the way that the guidelines are written currently, we can only require 10% in these multifamily developments. And we can only require it at 80% of the area median income. What that does, as you note, there's still market rate development going on outside of any of those inclusionary requirements, including our local. And so by only requiring 10%, you're consistently falling behind in terms of generating enough to get towards that 10%. So that's kind of what, a lot of people talk about. You'll never meet the 10%. You're always falling behind. It's always growing. What we are pursuing is an economic feasibility analysis. Again, talking about grants that we wouldn't be able to pursue. We have received a grant for an economic feasibility analysis, which will, if it justifies it, and from our housing production plan, I'm fairly confident will allow us to pursue greater percentages of affordability in these. So we could require up to 20% of affordable within these projects. So again, we'll see what the economic feasibility analysis says, and we'll have to adjust that language in terms of the 10%, or if we're allowed to go above that, where do we set that? Do we set it at the full 20% or somewhere in between? But we'll have that conversation after we've had the economic feasibility analysis and we know what we can put. I think the other piece that I wanted to touch on in terms of the new development, I think you're right, and I think we have to go back to that housing pressure. There have been a lot of new units created in town, and I agree. Let me find the slide. 1 second. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot that goes into the actual production of housing, and I think that's important. And again, 40B can propose a project like this anywhere in town. So we're, market conditions are there, and we're potentially subject to this development anywhere. A lot of times the strategy that the town has pursued really kind of goes back to that safe harbor provision, looking at pursuing friendly 40B projects, i.e. projects that we've negotiated with the developer in order to have community benefits in addition to being a 40B project, or projects such as Edgemere redevelopment or the Lakeway Commons redevelopment, which are allow us to achieve generation of affordable units, and that allows us to pursue that safe harbor provision. What that does, that locks developers in. If they have a 40B proposal, they have to negotiate through the friendly 40B process, and we're in no ways required to negotiate on that friendly 40B process if we're in the safe harbor provisions. But there is a benefit to trying to achieve and string along that safe harbor provision so that you're not subject to what they call as an unfriendly 40B, which means that there's no negotiation with the town. They do the minimum amount to meet the 40B requirements, and that's it. You're stuck with that, and that's the project that's proposed and that the Zoning Board of Appeals has to review. And so that market pressure is there. There's going to be generation of new units no matter what we pass here today. I do think that this zoning is written in a way that will help us to achieve some of those similar projects to Edgemere and Lakeway. It will provide an avenue towards safe harbor provisions through projects that are negotiated and subject to local control rather than the friendly 40B process. And rather than waiting for them to come to us, it allows us, we still will, because the private developer will still have to propose a project, but it sets the stage for us to consider that with greater local controls than what 40B does.
Sort of related to the previous question there. Can you talk about what percentage of the communities, how many communities in Massachusetts are actually compliant with the legislation now? And
So
second question, second part to that is, you mentioned that a significant number of towns are pursuing the compliance direction. Can you also talk about the non-compliant options? Overall, it's about $5 million in grants, and any studies that have been done towards evaluating what those non-compliant options are and the feasibilities of them for our town?
Yeah, so so communities subject, I think it's 122 communities that are subject to the MBTA communities bylaw.
177.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure, I haven't looked at the most recent number. They do list on their website of communities that have passed compliance. I don't have that figure in front of me, but I'm happy to look it up. The non-compliant, I think two of the major ones that we've been tracking is that Milton case.
A lot more.
Sorry?
A lot more.
A lot more what, that are,
Towns that are planning legal action that people are aware of. Maybe their boards don't know yet, but there are a lot more towns.
right. No, it's the two of the ones that we're tracking more closely is the Milton one. So, so the Milton process, so they did propose zoning, and the town then voted to essentially rescind that vote and remove the compliance. After that was taken back, that's when they were rendered non-compliant. Other ones that I've looked at, so the other one, I'm gonna blank on the community's name, but they were, sorry? Holden, thank you. So Holden was the other one, so they were pursuing zoning. And the Holden case, so they proposed the zoning and, or sorry, so they were pursuing non-compliant options. They were subject to civil action by two parties. So it was a community housing group as well as some individual parties that went on to that civil action. They were found after their court case that there was no standing for those two parties, but that does not mean that they won't be rendered non-compliant.
Gotcha, okay. Unrelated to this, it was also a question online, the kind of impact to the services in the community, in schools especially. You mentioned that this particular project or this proposal can yield but 0.6 per unit, right?
Right,
In
so,
terms- in
yeah,
terms of,
so, right, for every two units, one school
One,
choice.
one,
Right, so,
one addition, yeah.
yeah, and so, that's, we have those numbers from, we provide a memo annually that we update.
But has there been any,
I think it's .06.
Sorry, point zero,
.06.
thank you.
So, that's not one for every two.
Sorry, yeah.
but I heard
So-
point,
0.6 to 0.6.
point.
Sorry, so it does range, right, at the most aggressive levels, or the highest that we have seen at any point from those multifamilies is one for every two, so the 0.6. But generally, it falls in that range, 0.06 to 0.6.
But in terms of impact to the school district and whether the school district can actually absorb that additional number of students, what's the assessment there?
Right, so that's something that was asked Thursday for us to provide a deeper analysis of that actual, like, cost of school children. So our office is working on developing that deeper analysis to help the residents make a more informed decision. It is important to note that we cannot regulate in terms of school children. That doesn't mean that it's not something that we do track as we try to inform our own planning processes. Certainly we understand that's a concern of the public, so we do try to keep be mindful of that and the cost impacts of development. But we'll provide that information when we're able to develop it, looking at the cost per pupil, as well as other costs in terms of emergency services and such like that. And we'll compare that with revenues generated from typical projects.
Gotcha, okay, thank you.
Just as an idea, there's 5,900 students, so our current 15,000-ish housing units, we're at about 0.3 today. So if you did that math, and you said it was 0.3, if you still did the same math, you would still increase the school population by 590 students, which is essentially the size of the new Beale, which is about 600.
Yeah.
And you'd be bigger than Spring Street, and I think, because those are about 2 in the 200s, they're like, population's like 290.
Yeah.
So it is essentially another elementary school, if you did get that many housing. So even if you said it was half, it would still be another smaller school.
Adding a
that you-
significant
Yes, yes. That's just the numbers, I'm not saying, that's the math today.
other
Right,
than that also
and again, it's important to know that, you know, we're not proposing that we're creating 1,500 new units. That's why we're looking to zone where there is existing, you know, the 644 that are already existing units there, and utilizing that as also a redevelopment tool to drive some mixed-use development, so.
Yeah, we need water and sewer infrastructure also.
Sorry?
Water and sewer.
Right, so the water and sewer infrastructure, so the state's position on that, palatable or unpalatable as it has been, is that is on the developer and the community to negotiate. As I kind of mentioned earlier, so Walnut Street currently does not have the infrastructure to provide for development at significant scale. And likely we would be looking for any proposed development to provide funding or contributions towards such infrastructure improvements.
Hi. All right. Back to the grants for a second. So you said that the grants could be affected, but they may or may not be affected. And the state is threatening us with this, but we don't know how long they may be denied. Do we have any idea how long they're going to hold this against us?
Yeah, so
Is it like
as,
forever?
as it's written, it would be forever. So until the town is compliant, they would be ineligible for the 13 discretionary grants. They also say, you know, have left that somewhat open-ended. In addition to the 13 grants that they've specifically identified, they've essentially said that, you know, there may be impacts on other grants that they have not yet specified. And
So
that
those
number grew. It
grants-
was originally a very small number of grants that grew to 13 over the release of the compliance guidelines. So it does show this, the state has taken a stance of, as communities look for non-compliance, they have ramped up the impacts to those non-compliant communities.
Okay, but we don't have a fiscal impact from what this may look like to offset this 5 million. Like what overall, obviously, so let me start with this. So I don't understand why we would rezone something with no intention to build it. That makes 0 sense.
So all zoning is done with typically no project in mind. So the zoning that you do is setting the stage for private development. And so that's, you know, what we're working on here is we're providing the zoning. Private development will respond to that zoning in some way. We're not taking away their rights to build under the existing zoning. This just provides the flexibility to, that the state is mandating to allow certain housing development in this zone. And we've used the design criteria, that's, as the overlay, that's the other side of that. By getting the flexibility, we're asking for those design guidelines and those specific criteria to be.
Yeah, so we're not inviting like commercial developers into our town to increase our economic development.
So the way we've written this strongly leans towards, and when you look at the district and how we drew it and how we wrote the zoning, it really does lend itself mostly towards mixed-use development as a more viable option.
So is that what you're
Unless,
hoping-
unless it's in the existing residential areas, that's where we're required to allow certain multifamily development. But we really drew it where there's already significant existing.
So that's what we're hoping for like Christmas Tree Shop Plaza?
I would think that would be the most likely outcome of the zoning.
Okay, because watching the November of '23 Board of Selectmen meeting, you had mentioned that we would not rezone an existing commercial or industrial area for this.
Right, so
Or
just,
try not to, I
right,
should say.
So to clarify, so that was the goal with this zoning is really, and as we drew it, was to put zoning in existing density. We wanted to use that mandatory mixed-use offset, which is 374 units. What we've done, in order to protect the underlying commercial industrial zones, any developer who is choosing to use this, this zoning provision, if the underlying zoning is commercial or industrial, they'll be required to include a commercial component. And it could be up to, we're allowing the planning board to consider up to 33% of the actual square footage area. And that's
So
the
they can't-
maximum that.
They
that the-
can't take down Christmas tree shop and just put up residential, you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, that's good to know.
It's not a rezone, it's an overlay.
Correct.
It doesn't take it from one style to another, it offers another option.
So a developer looking at Christmas tree shops could still say, I want to build a similar development to Christmas tree shops, if that's what the zoning supports.
But just
as
include a
commercial.
residential component with a
They're
mixed
not,
use.
not
to it.
required to.
Right, I just mean if they wanted to use
they
the
wanted to,
overlay.
they would have
They
that
could
option.
add a mixed use component and, okay. How much of our current how many of our current projects, are there any of them that are in the works currently that are in this overlay?
So there's no project proposed under where this overlay is.
Okay.
Currently.
I didn't know if there were any that would count towards it. I think that's it for now. I just think, as a town meeting member, I don't think that I should be forced to dictate the market. I think that landlords should be bringing down their rent and making things more affordable for people. Thank you.
Thank you. And this zoning still allows that if a property owner wanted to reduce their rents, they could. We are providing that affordability component to the maximum extent that we can under the guidelines, requiring those caps in rental rates or home sales for portions of the units created under anything with this zoning.
Just one more question.
Yeah. Please, just for the, I don't know if we still have people online, I just want to make sure they can hear. Thank you.
I just think you should change that slide because it's not grant opportunities at risk. That's what you already spent. But anyway,
Fair enough.
What's Plan B?
Sorry?
What's Plan B? Let's say this does not pass both town meeting.
So, Plan B, we'd have to reevaluate. Likely, we'd have another proposal for the town to consider in the fall. You know, to the extent that we could, we'll take in any public comment that we can. But again, that's why we're really looking to engage with the public now to understand what they'd like to see in terms of a proposal for compliance. We're happy to tailor this as best we can to meet those concerns and meet those needs.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Just one quick clarification on where the parcel needs to be. Did you say it had to be within a half mile? Or am I hearing things?
No, it may have been one of the other commenters, but thank you. I'd meant to touch base on that. So there's actually for Shrewsbury, there's no locational requirements.
Okay,
Communities that have an MBTA station within them have some locational requirements where portions of their district need to be within a certain distance of their MBTA station, but we don't have an MBTA station within our bounds, so we're adjacent, so we can put it anywhere in the community.
okay. And we're considered an adjacent community because,
Because there's no MBTA station within our town borders.
and we're how far from the closest MBTA station? Is that part of this whole concept?
So no, but so from this proposed district, that the closest would be the Westboro train station. It's about 1.5 miles.
Right, but if I'm understanding that there's obviously towns that don't have to do this, is that correct?
Yeah.
Correct,
Okay.
yeah, so
So
we're,
how did we then become kind of
thank you.
an
So-
abutter?
Thank you, so that's.
How's
as-
that?
As an adjacent community, so
Thank you.
because communities next to us have MBTA stations, we're considered served by the MBTA, and adjacent community because of that.
I think it's listed in 161A, I think there's a Mass General that defines the MBTA, and they list the towns in there, and that's what they're referenced in the statute, just to be technical, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay. And And just again, sorry, I'm gonna ask the 50 acres. The 50 acres / 100 can be anywhere. They all don't have to be grouped together.
Correct.
Is that correct?
And you can split the zone. There are contiguity in terms of the adjacency of the parcels. Again, the background of this, I didn't want to get really into the weeds, but there's a compliance model that we have to run. It's essentially a large Excel sheet that we have to run through, plug in the zoning that we have, and the GIS, the graphic information system layers that we have, all that information from the parcels, and it essentially analyzes that and kicks out, where we are in terms of developable space. So that'll pull out, land area that's conservation land and is excluded. So there's requirements that at least one of the districts be 25 acres. No other district can be less than 5 acres. So again, we were really careful in terms of where we were drawing these lines to really limit and try to draw as close as we could in terms of the getting to that capacity requirement, but not going significantly over.
And they don't allow to have you have different areas. Could you legit rezone different areas that already have this type of housing?
So you could, and with this proposal, we have done that, even though it's not split. So the way the compliance model looks at it is even the commercial and industrial, so because we've required those as mandatory mixed use, those technically, the way the state views that, those technically aren't included in the MBTA. We do get that offset from them, so we've included them in the analysis. But it looks at it, the way the compliance model, that Excel sheet looks at it, it's two separate districts. And so we've kind of done that already here. Again, we did evaluate those 6 other locations, and we did look at kind of the potential new units of that. What we saw with a lot of those other areas that we were evaluating, the options that we were left with is either not doing the mandatory mixed use and allowing multifamily in the commercial districts, or we would have to encroach into single-family neighborhoods in order to meet those 5-acre minimums or otherwise meet that residential component. And neither of those options we saw as really palatable.
Thank you. And just to ask, so they could not build this on commercial or limited industrial, correct? Or because it will be a mixed use, it would be forced to be a mixed use?
Right, so the way.
That wouldn't count towards the numbers, correct? Is that what you're saying?
So it would.
If I'm understanding it.
So it would. So it's important, it's not a housing target, so no matter what is built, it doesn't affect us in terms of compliance. Whether they build 1 unit or 20 units, it's not a housing target. We just have to pass the zoning, and then we're considered compliant. The way we wrote the zoning is that anywhere that the underlying district is commercial or industrial, it has to be mixed use, and you can't do multifamily by right. And so we do still get 374 units of capacity out of that commercial area. And that's the maximum, because that's 25% of our 140 or 1,497 unit capacity.
Okay. Also, with the style of housing, I could have heard this incorrectly, not here tonight, but just listening to the news, is that housing that in other towns that have been, say, can't say they're triple deckers, but maybe something along of like a double decker, those are not included in the count. Is something like that not included? Do you know? If that style of house was built, because that would be my concern. They would come forward with a certain style of housing, and it's not gonna meet the criteria.
So again,
And I know it would go in front of zoning, I understand.
so again, it doesn't matter what private development proposes under this zoning. style or otherwise, in terms of our compliance. The way we have it written, we would still allow single-family, two-family, or three-family in this zoning, and that's because we wrote it, so anything 15 units or less per acre would be through that site plan approval process.
Okay, thank you.
But to be clear, that 1,500 acres with complying on that zone is as of right. They do not have to get a permit to go through that. They don't have to go through any of the other permitting processes.
They do. They have to go to the planning board for site plan approval.
But they will get it. If I comply under the zone, the 1,500, it's, the law is very clear, and we know how 40B works. They will be able to build those units as long as it fits within that current overlay zone. So it is 1,500 units.
So I don't want to say that they will, because there is, there are specific criteria that the site plan approval process lays out that they have to meet. Unlike the special permit process where there's a lot more discretion of the board, the site plan approval process really spells out the developer must meet this criteria. And if they do, the planning board has very little discretion in terms of rendering a decision to deny that project. They are still allowed to attach conditions to that project that are, reasonable.
These are sophisticated developers that know that law.
And we're a sophisticated local board and staff as well, so.
How is Westboro doing? Are they being compliant?
Yeah, so Westboro just recently passed their zoning. They're looking at a number of their existing multifamily. They overlaid a number of their existing multifamily developments. One of them, I don't remember the names of the actual specific developments, but two of them are directly on Route 9.
The village at Westboro and it's the commons.
Avis, or is it Arrow or? Arrive, thank you. And then one on Glendale Street, close to Walnut Street. And that was to meet their locational requirement, the 25 acre, or the acres.
Park, I think Park.
Yes, yep.
I might be going a little off topic here, but I think I heard this is coming down the pike. 40R, is that a mandate that's coming to force towns to provide more inclusionary housing? And is this going to come into play?
So 40R, that's already written into the legislation. So 40R districts, what those are, and the MBTA, the specific guidelines actually cite 40R districts as eligible under MBTA for compliance. Some communities have already passed 40R districts. What that is, that was, way back, the state passed provisions that communities could pass a 40R district for high-density multifamily units. And it's almost word for word what these provisions are mandating in many cases. We are in the process of evaluating if this could be a 40R district. That's tied to our economic feasibility analysis. If that comes back as favorable and we're allowed to pursue the 20% of affordable housing, and we decide that we want to pursue that 20% of affordable housing, we can then also apply for this to be considered as, in addition to the 3A compliant district, a 40R district. And really the only impact that would have is it opens up funding opportunities for the community. So a lot of what we looked at with this is that this proposal, this mandate, is pretty much all stick and no carrot. If we propose this, since we have to write the zoning anyways as a 40R district, we open up those funding opportunities and it becomes somewhat a carrot.
I wouldn't we just go to that?
We need to get the economic feasibility analysis, and we need to determine with the community that we want to pursue 20% required affordable.
Okay. I just had a question about the inclusionary housing. I don't know how long ago I started getting involved, but project after project after project, all I've watched is developers just pay fee in lieu of. Why are we allowing this time after time after time? We're never gonna get to our 10%, and we're never gonna have affordable units in this town. Why do we just keep allowing it? You know, I'll never understand it. And where is that? I know I heard something about where that money's going to go in this picture, but can you explain it?
Yeah, so
Please.
the fee in lieu
Thank you.
process, we've had that provision on the books as long as we've had the inclusionary housing bylaw. What that does, so there's in lieu of providing the actual affordable units in a development, a developer can pursue a separate special permit with the planning board to authorize. There's 4 options of alternative affordability components. One of those is a fee in lieu. What that does, the developer proposes the fee in lieu, and if the planning board grants that special permit, it's on our webpage, the actual fee in lieu. It's a formula that we update each year, and the planning board authorizes. That fee is then paid directly into the Affordable Housing Trust. And the Affordable Housing Trust has the charge of developing and creating opportunities for affordable housing in the town. And the trust has just passed their action plan recently, so. In the comments?
One last question. I know there was like $2 million of funds, I know that well, I think they spent for consulting services to help towns become compliant. Did we utilize any consultants externally to help with to put together any of the compliance for this?
So no, we've primarily pursued this in-house, and I think because we knew that this was going to be a sensitive topic, we wanted to make sure that we were pursuing this with town staff in-house rather than having an outside consultant kind of dictate where we could go. We saw that this required direct involvement from staff that's tied to the community. Sorry, but I should say for the compliance model, we are utilizing district local technical assistance with Central Massachusetts Regional Planning Agency or Commission. So they're just helping us to run that compliance model. We're doing that in-house as well, but they've done some of the legwork in terms of filling out those forms that we then utilize. So just going back to some of the comments on the chat, have we explored whether any residents in town that are attorneys would be willing to take this on as a pro bono case against the AG? We have not, to my knowledge, explored that option. What happens if the LOC that bought Christmas Tree Plaza sells it in 5 years? Is there a max on what future developers could build? So that's a really good question. I know we've gotten that a couple times of, what's the new developer? How does that affect or the new property owner, how does that affect our proposal? And simply put, it was private property before, it's private property now, and so it has no effect in terms of our compliance.
But just to that point,
Mhm.
if the gentleman that bought it puts up a giant trampoline park because that's his business, right? That zone is no longer useful within the law.
But it doesn't render us
That
that.
is no longer useful within as compliant in the law. Isn't that correct?
No, so it would still be subject to the zone. So again, no matter what private development does, it does not affect our compliance. We simply have to pass the zoning we're rendered compliant. Private development can still pursue options with the zoning that we've provided, but it won't affect our compliance, whether they build 1 unit, 100 units, that does not affect our compliance. It's not a production target, like we don't have to produce any units under the zoning in order to maintain compliance.
If the developer feels that trampoline park is gonna make him more money, he's gonna build a trampoline park, right? Who knows, right? But, you know what I mean, like, it's like you said, it's private property, they can build what they want, and we just have to be compliant with the zoning and show that it's there.
But if a developer comes on and doesn't follow the compliance, and we're just in charge of the zoning, but then the state says, well, hey, you allow somebody to do something, and now we're not gonna give you your grant money that you have to apply for, and it's not guaranteed, and then now the taxpayers are stuck, paying for extra infrastructure, schools, what have you, and I feel like we don't know that the Attorney General's office or Maura Healy and all her cronies won't keep moving the target on us. And because so far, the way they've responded to people hasn't actually been nice.
So they do have in writing that this is not requiring communities to create units. And so again, whatever private development does, as it's currently written, we would still be rendered compliant. If that needle was moved, we would, evaluate how we're gonna respond to that if there's additional MBTA compliance that are issued. So it is, yeah.
Is that they're not gonna change stuff in 2 years when she changes her mind, or wants us to build a train station in Shrewsbury? I mean, being real, because it's kind of ridiculous, especially for the towns that don't have MBTA anywhere near them.
Right, so again, there's no requirement for us to produce units. The state does have that in their presentations, and so if we pass this zoning and we met the criteria, and we show that we meet the criteria, if the AG's office and EOHLC says that we are now rendered compliant, regardless of what a developer does, if for whatever reason in response to that, the governor's office said that they wanted to render us non-compliant because it didn't create as many units as they thought it would. Again, I don't think that would happen. But if they said that, we would just point to their presentation that says it's not a generation, that communities are not required to generate units.
So I think to your point, the state's not a fair and equitable partner in this. And I would say Wellesley's a good example, right? Wellesley's gonna pass a zone, an overlay. The state's already said you're not in compliance because they basically put an overlay on top of things that already existed.
Right.
So I think if the letter of the law is there, I would say the politicians are saying it is a build law. They are gonna push that. So to your point, I think the valid concern is they can tell us all they want. It's what they wanna do, right? I mean,
And
politician opens their mouth and we can assume they're not telling the
And-
truth.
and-
So I mean, I think that's not every politician, not necessarily a town politician, I want to make that clear. But I think the state is not acting equitably to towns that are asking some legitimate questions. I think we can fairly say that.
I mean, I think that's a somewhat fair argument in terms of the Wellesley example, and I think that's something that we have been tracking, and kind of some of, in previous presentations, I think what it was discussed is that this meets, in my opinion, some of the intent of the law. So we haven't done even, we just saw Westboro literally propose it over their existing zoning, a similar example. And it's not that we're not doing that here. We are utilizing this tool as a redevelopment tool to drive that mixed-use development. Again, I think the realistic result of this zoning, in large part, is going to be a mixed-use development proposed under it for one of those parcels. So what that does is I think we're not expressly doing that. We're not being cheeky in terms of how we're passing the zoning in a way that the state can then, pursue additional action or say that, this doesn't meet the intent, that it's clearly, looking to supersede what the intent of the law was. It is in that way, you know, towards that compliance, I think. So I think we're better protected from that type of argument. Again, I think that's why we're pursuing it in May. We're really trying to tailor this to make it as close to our estimation of compliant as possible and address every, you know, potential non-compliant option. What that will do is then we'll see what the AG's office and UHLC say after Maytown meeting if this passes, and then we'll have to reevaluate after their comments are back, and we're hoping to have that fall town meeting if there's adjustments. And again, I talked about some of the detail they get into is like the specifics of the parking requirements, and so we want to make sure that we're having that protection to still be able to pursue those grant opportunities. And ultimately, to put it bluntly, when faced with this zoning, I had a similar reaction of, I don't want to be told how to zone in the community, and so when we looked at developing this zoning, obviously we looked at compliance, and that's where it goes back to that minimum effective compliance. And the zoning that we wrote, I really do see this as we were looking at utilizing it as a redevelopment tool. And again, that's born out of a lot of the community input. So how do we utilize a compliant zone to achieve local goals? And I think really what we did is we wrote this at first blush without even looking at the compliance criteria, again, drawing on some of our local zoning that has produced projects such as the Lakeway overlay. And we looked at that as a redevelopment tool. Then we overlaid the compliance criteria and we refined the language to make sure that we're, to the extent that we know, are going to be rendered compliant as well. And so that was kind of the process. So at first I did want to look at, regardless of the compliance criteria, if I had to write zoning for this location, how do we do that? And then how do we fit that with the compliance criteria? And I think this achieves that.
So I have one suggestion, like we have around 15,000 houses in the Shrewsbury, and if individually go for just pay $300 or $350 individual house, we can accommodate like 5 million amount, and we don't have to go with that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I got all that.
So what I'm saying, like we have around 15,000 houses in the Shrewsbury. Each individual house is, we can charge like around $350. That accommodate us like $5 million, and we can avoid that everything what we are discussing here.
Right. I mean that's part of the question, right? If we go for non-compliance and we're not able to pursue these grants, what is that effect on the taxpayer, the individual taxpayer? And it might be minimal, but again, that in terms of the initiatives that we pursue, the work that we conduct every day as a town staff, a lot of that is tied to grants and utilizes grant funding so that we can drive that work farther, whether it's utilizing consultants to do the studies and to help us to engage in the public process, to expand our capacity, to inform local decisions, or whether it's actual infrastructure projects such as the MassWorks grant and improvements to our infrastructure. So I don't know. Again, it's hard to say in terms of what grants we'll pursue over the next 10 years, what that impact would be financially. And it's hard to say what that impact would be to the individual property owner. But it certainly wouldn't be no impact. I think in order to make up that quality of life that the residents have come to expect and should expect from their community, and the services that they expect, that grant funding is a crucial part of providing that level of service that we need to see. Anything more? I just want to check real quick if there's any more in the online. Cost benefit analysis, the grants needs to be done. So again, that was something, it's still going to be speculative, but we're gonna work on, looking at a deeper analysis, especially in terms of the, school children impact. That's been a comment that we've received, a number of times. So we're gonna try to dig into those numbers in a little bit more detail and have those for the community prior to town meeting. And then, why pursue grants? I think I answered that, as to why, in my opinion, we need to pursue those grants. So, if there's not any, yeah, go ahead.
Can you just put up the dates again for everyone?
Yes, absolutely.
That would be
Thank you, great,
Thank you.
great point.
Krista, there's a whole page for this too on the
Yeah.
website.
And I got an email in today.
Yeah, so these are our dates to engage with staff and with the various boards. So again, April 4th, that's tomorrow, we'll have a planning board public hearing at 7 p.m. I actually won't be there, but we will have staff available as well as the planning board. April 19th, we have a drop-in session, that's 10 a.m. to noon, and that'll be in Conference Room A in the Municipal Center. That's meant to be a little bit more of a intimate one-on-one, really informal. There's, not necessarily gonna be a presentation depending upon how many people show up. It's really geared towards just conversation, kind of like we had at the end of this. May 2nd, we'll have another planning board public hearing. That'll be at 7 p.m. I will be in attendance for that one. And then May 15th, we're going to have another drop-in session from 6 to 8 p.m. So again, we're trying to hit a lot of different timelines. We know not everyone can meet at the end of the day. We know not everyone can meet during the middle of the day. So I'm trying to spread those out and make sure that we're able to connect with everyone. That project page, as we go, everything is going up on that project page. There's a lot of information there. And as always, we are a full-service planning department. Any of those regular office hours, we do have staff available. Please do feel free to either call, come on in, send us a letter or an email, and we're happy to try and respond to the questions that we can, and engage with the public on a daily basis. So for those that like QR codes, we have our planning board notifications QR code there to get signed up, so you can get notified as we go through this process. So with that, again, thank you all for attending. I really do appreciate the time and the feedback that you've given, and I look forward to engaging with you further.
And for